So last night we recorded a special edition of Normal Ireland where we covered the Conservative Party conference with our guest, the amazing No Justice MTG. Unfortunately, the video footage was unusable. That's what happens when you work on a zero budget. Thankfully, we still have the audio so you can still enjoy our discussions. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy. Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Normal Ireland where we're going to look at the top stories from the Conservative Party Conference 2023, which has currently been held in Manchester. With me tonight, friend of the show, the absolutely amazing, the brilliant Helena, mainly known as No Justice MTG. Thank you for joining me tonight. You've had a pretty busy day.
I have just come off of my second Novara Live appearance and probably be streaming later as well. So very, very busy day for me. It was great to be here. Thank you for inviting me on the show today.
Yeah, there's a bit of a crossover with our audience, but if people don't already, you must go and subscribe to Helena. Her YouTube channel is at No Justice MTG. You can follow her on all socials at No Justice MTG. But let's get into the stories. First up is actually a story from yesterday, but it's significant, and that is Liz Truss. Now, we have been blessed to see her return because shame is clearly a thing she doesn't have. The shortest serving Prime Minister and wrecking the economy on her way out. Now, she has been making headlines these last few months. A new book to be released next year, 10 Years to Save the West. And at this conference, she believes that the Tories should be pushing for the same policies that led to her resignation in the first place. Helena, can you tell me about Truss's return?
Now, the thing that I noticed the most about the Liz Truss speech at the Conservative conference was the fact that most people were in the room where she was speaking. We've seen loads of photos that have been going around the internet a lot of empty seats in the main conference hall for the people whose speeches that we don't really care about. But Liz Truss, she's popular. She's very popular amongst the Conservative membership, amongst the press, amongst the hangers-on, namely Nigel Farage, who she certainly shares ideological principles, but at least when it comes to the economy. Hence why Nigel Farage was on record as saying, finally, a truly Conservative budget on that fateful weekend of the fiscal event. And it seems to be that this is clear to everyone, though there's a gigantic schism in the Conservative Party. Now, I talked about earlier today that I think there's a three-way schism in the party, in that you've got like the wet Tory managerial types on one end, you've got the ultra free market libertarian types like Liz Truss, and you've got the actual nationalists like Suella Braverman. And these different sects of the party are in continual conflict. But given on how the actual membership voted back in the original leadership election that Rishi Sunak lost and Liz Truss won, it was very clear from the support that was had for Liz Truss and also Kemi Badenoch, who's also from that libertarian wing, the pro-free market wing, that Liz Truss really is where the Conservative base actually does lie. They just want tax cuts. They just want the business sector to be given free rein to do whatever they want. And they want to be the party of capital again, which they are not at the moment currently because of all of their failures in policy. And these people are so ideologically committed to free market neoliberalism, despite all of the failures of the fiscal event and how optically poisonous it is. And not just that, how just generally disliked it is. No one in this country wants their brand of politics. There's no electoral base for slashing taxes on the rich and gutting public services and doing spending cuts. No one wants austerity politics anymore. And it's only like the guy from Question Time who thinks he's in the bottom 50% earning £80,000 a year who are deluded enough to actually support Liz Truss in the first place. So there's no electoral base for it. It's undermining the Conservative Party's current leadership, and it makes them look like fighting like cats in a sack when it comes to how unified the party looks to the public. I mean, it's the worst possible thing for the Conservative Party to do right now, but they're too blind to see it because they're so ideologically fixated on this free market libertarian idea that she wants to push straight from Tufton Street to the Exchequer.
There are many people in the Tory party who believe they're going to lose the next election. I mean, I think we all know that's going to happen. So, as I referenced earlier, optically, this doesn't look good. The Labour Party are laughing. Do you think that Liz Truss knows this? And potentially her team around her are just trying to push the debate towards the right, maybe try and make an incoming Labour government more right-wing, which is kind of funny because they're doing that all themselves. Are they setting a right-wing vision? Are they trying to set the terms of debate? Or does Liz Truss and the free marketeers around her believe that this is actually going to win the next election.
There's no case for them winning the next election. But I think they really do think that. I don't think that there's this kind of long-term plan necessarily. I just think they want to have free marketers in power regardless of the cost. I don't think that the whole wing of the party is smart enough, really and truly, to have the kind of long-term plan that like a Farage would have, or a Starmer would have. Or I mean, when I say Starmer, I really mean Morgan McSweeney, but that's a story for another time. But the this public opinion on Liz Truss is so sour. If they had a plan to shift the public narrative and rhetoric towards free market policies, they've gone the wrong way about it by making them the most toxic they possibly could be by using them to crash the economy first up.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's clearly not good news for the Tory party. I think we can all see it. We can kind of have a laugh and a joke, but we just think the opposition party is not too much better. But on to our next story. It was speculated for a long time that HS2 wouldn't be completed. Whispers of phase 3, which is the line up towards Manchester, will be scrapped. And it's looking like that's going to be the case. And I think it's funny and ironic that the party conference is currently in Manchester. Now, the initial cost of HS2 way back in 2015 was supposed to be 50 billion in its entirety, yet the bill sits at double of over 100 billion, and it's not even been completed. Helena, surely this is one of the biggest disasters for any kind of project. It is just a huge, huge failure, right?
Oh, it's a gigantic failure. I mean, I literally spend every single waking moment of my political advocacy. Why can we build stuff? Why can we not build anything? Like capital expenditure is the one thing that you can always make the case for deficit spending on. We just don't do it. We don't build anything, right? The costs for HS2 have spiraled out of control because we've continually had to pander to NIMBYs in the home counties who don't want to have a train going near them, right? Different tiny pieces of woodland. Like, don't get me wrong, I think conservation is a really important thing. I'm a Green Party member after all. But all of these woodland areas that are going to have trains running through them because of HS2 that have continually seen blockages and tunnels being put in, all these different things that have got in the way of HS2, those mean nothing if the planet burns to a cinders. We need to get people out of their cars and into trains, and we'll do that by inducing the demand rather than trying to, stop people driving. We need to build the trains to do that. China builds miles and miles and miles of high-speed rail every year. And we can't even build one lousy high-speed line from Birmingham to Manchester. We can barely build one from London to Birmingham. And the optics, again, of doing in Manchester, where the entirety of the conference is being overshadowed by this gigantic failure, that not just the increase in price because of legal challenges and NIMBYs getting in the way and changes to the design, all these different private subcontractors offering different rates, scalping the state for every single excess penny that they can get, being chopped and changed over time. Just terrible planning from the Conservative Party for years. And the worst part about all of this is there is no mandate for this. There is no mandate at all. We were promised HS2. We were promised Northern Powerhouse Rail in the manifesto in 2019, which Rishi Sunak was elected on. He was elected on this manifesto. This is a breaking a manifesto pledge, which you should be held to in completing HS2. But of course, this is people in the north. They don't matter. I thought they were trying to win back, keep the Red Wall seats. How are we going to keep Red Wall seats if you take the one thing that they were going to get to equalise them? With the Westminster bubble only care about the financial sector in London, and then you ditch it, or scale it down, I think is the new line for this one, turn it into like a normal rail line rather than a high-speed rail, I think is the line they're going for at this point in time. But it's just, like, it almost makes you think they're trying to deliberately lose the election by being completely incompetent, having no explicit line, because they've been prevaricating about this for a week or so since the rumours of cancellation were abounding. And they've just not gotten on top of it. Like, the fact that Spade's in the ground is now a meme because Rishi Sunak keeps saying it, essentially to try and avoid answering the question because they don't know what they're doing either. Just shows how pathetically incompetent this absolute band of buffoons are.
The bill is at 100 billion, and I just think you might as well just finish it. It's actually, you cut your losses. It's just insane to me. Now, look, privatization has definitely had an impact on this. But I was researching about how the contract system is set up with HS2. And what was astonishing is for such a big project like HS2, it wasn't just contracted out to just one or two big companies. They've contracted HS2 to multiple. I'm talking about a lot of different businesses, large and small. When you have more businesses, you end up having to write more contracts, lawyers. That bureaucracy has made it more expensive. So yes, privatization, but the Tories have also completely mucked up this privatization on it. It's complete mismanagement.
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. It is the classic case of not just privatization failing, but neoliberal administrations failing because they just don't know. They have no interest in governance, right? We've talked about this before. If you've read Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Big Con, where she talks about how essentially no ministers in government have any idea what they're doing because all of the talent they should be learning or the skills they should be learning in government are being subcontracted out to management consultants to make advisory comments on what they should or shouldn't be doing. And so they've essentially abdicated the responsibility of governance out to the private sector management consultant teams. And of course, what else do they advise them? You should have a contract out with the people that I know. So all these different management consultants have their snoot in the trough, wanting their subsidiaries to get these government contracts like Serco, G4S, whatever, all the different construction companies. And it's just not only do we have a failure of governance, not only do we have a failure of the actual implementation of these things, on top of that, nothing ever gets done at all. And it makes the case for us. What we should have is a publicly owned developer, owned by the state, which runs things at cost because you don't need for profits. There's no need for CEOs, and you actually have government ministers responsible for running it who are not allowed to abdicate their responsibility by using management consultants. It's just the absolute worst excesses of neoliberalism coming home to roost in every single possible sense of that phrase. But as with always, the leftoids were right. Just keep this in the public sector. Look at China. China builds so much rail, as mentioned before. What do they have? A state-owned developer. It makes sense.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because China have built, I believe, 10,000 kilometers in 7 years. And not only did it cost less per square mile, the total cost, it was 70 billion, is less than what we spent on HS2.
Just HS2. Just HS2.
It's just incredible. And I'm also glad you kind of brought the CEO pay. We're talking 700,000, 500,000, some of your CEOs to essentially we're paying them to not build something. So we can't seem to get anything right. We can't have any good things in this country.
Nope.
No. But we move on. The NHS, it's in its most vulnerable state since its creation. The median waiting time has tripled since 2010. Funding has fallen below the long-term average, and the conditions of NHS workers has forced them to strike against the government. Clearly, we have a huge crisis in healthcare, not to mention social care too. So what do we get at conference? Health Secretary Steve Barclay has announced that trans women won't be allowed in women's wards, claiming that the Tories know what a woman is. This was reported from The Independent. The Health Secretary promised in his conference speech to restore common sense to the health service and recognise the importance of biological sex in healthcare. He said women's rights have been sidelined and announced changes that will see men and women given the right to receive care on single-sex wards. So not only has the Tories provided no solutions to the crisis of the health service, they managed to bring culture wars back into it by contributing to the already insidious transphobic campaign currently being waged in this country. Eleanor, this is disgusting, grotesque. But the Tories, are they just incredibly desperate? Is that what they're playing at here?
Yes and no. So they are desperate, and they are throwing red meat to their supporters. They do want to create culture wars to distract you from the class war, as has been the reserve of all conservative governments in history, right? They will always, when they fail on the economy, they have nowhere else to go other than social policy, because they cannot be trusted on the economy anymore. No one believes that. No one believes they're fiscally responsible. They are behind Labour on the economy, and they've been doing so for a very, very, very long time since, even under Boris Johnson, they were behind on the economy rather than Labour. And so they have to retreat to social policy. But I think it's more insidious than just grasping at straws. It's clear that the gender critical campaign is very, very large in the Conservative Party. They've had the LGB Alliance and people like that having stalls at their conferences It's very clear who they ally with on this. Tufton Street have been helping them in trying to build reactionary policy. So, for example, the anti-trans policy of outing children at school to their parents if they come out as transgender. This was guidance that was constructed by Policy Exchange in a document with a foreword from Rosie Duffield, which had essentially been adopted in full by the Conservative Party. They have Tufton Street think tanks writing reactionary social policy for them, because these are the people who have the finger on the pulse of how to be able to market these things in the most kind of reactionary manner possible, in the way that the public can theoretically get on board with. And there's a long-term plan here. I was mentioning before, earlier today, that when you look at Conservative policy, there's always a long-term plan. Like, for example, the failure on the irregular migration of the small boats has been a desire to try and undermine the European Convention on Human Rights. Suella Braverman's been very clear that she wants to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, and that's small boat crisis has been used as a proxy to attack it. What I think they're trying to do with this, because I think they will find issues with this sex-separated ward stuff without trans people being included, I think they'll come up against reservations in the Equality Act. So this might be their desire to use this as a wedge issue to try and undermine the Equality Act. I mean, there was someone else from Tufton Street from the IEA at their think tent at the Conservative conference saying that we should replace the Equalities Act with a Freedoms Act. It's clear that the Tufton Street ghouls are aiming for the Equalities Act, and it stands to reason for me, given how good the Conservatives are at long-term planning, they will be trying to use this particular wedge issue as a proxy to remove the Equalities Act altogether. It's a very distressing time to be transgender, I must admit.
But sadly, that's not the only incredibly transphobic announcement to come out of conference, because, well, as you said, Suella Braverman has announced some more things, that sex offenders cannot change their name or gender. Now, this is from The Independent. Suella Braverman is set to enact a ban on sex offenders from changing their name or gender in an attempt to tighten up rules around the sex offenders register. The Home Secretary is expected to use her Tory conference speech in Manchester to promise new legislation to close a loophole allowing predators to avoid the register. Registered sex offenders who change their name are supposed to notify the local police force within 3 days, but have been able to use a loophole to evade detection on the disclosure and barring service. Now, of course, the ban on changing gender is obviously a dog whistle, because it's equating the queer community as sexual abusers. It's completely grotesque, and I just want to get your thoughts on that.
So, I have a bit of a nuanced take on this one. So, there is a large optical issue with even individual anecdotal cases of sex offenders then coming out as transgender later. For example, you look at Isla Bryson as the very, very large case, which I'm assuming is what this is a reaction to. Now, people lie about the Isla Bryson case all the time in trying to say she was sent to a women's prison when really she was in solitary whilst they made a decision on sending her back to a men's prison, whatever. And I think that there is something to be gained from ensuring that there is no ability for anyone who is trying to do this, which is in some way tactical, because they feel like they can get away with it if they are a cisgender man who wants to pretend to be transgender to gain access to certain things, or to even just be a transgender sex offender. These people are not optically good for the transgender community. Now, on the flip side, though, I am against this legislation specifically because I think, again, that this doesn't end here. Once you try and start having rules about when you can't change your name, something everybody should be able to do. Everybody should be able to change their name. It's not something that's indelible on your genetics. It's something that you choose as a social function. Where does this end, right? I hate a slippery slope fallacy, but this is my worry. I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen or that it's necessarily going to happen. But once you get to the point at which you can start deciding when people are not allowed to be legally transgender, that can then open up the door for that potential to expand to other regions, right? That's what I fear. There's another part of this that's dangerous as well, is that she says sex offenders register, not if you've been convicted of sexual assault or if you have been convicted of child pornography or paedophilia or something like that. She just says any sexual offence, right? Engaging in sex work counts as having to register on the sex offenders register, right? There are lots of trans people who are forced into sex work because they can't get jobs anywhere else. Especially now, considering that a lot of avenues to get involved in normal work at this point are being shot off as the kind of transphobic panic has spread through the UK, driven by the right-wing press, and indeed sometimes the liberal press as well, if you look at what The Guardian have been doing over the last few years or so. So trans people get pushed into sex work all the time because it's a growing industry at the moment, and trans people are inherently sexualized all the time. And if you engage in sex work in a way, especially if you're poor and you're destitute, you're forced into sex work that you don't want to do out of necessity, and you get caught doing something which is nebulously illegal, right? There are so many different laws around how you can and can't do sex work legally in this country, which I won't go into now, but it's very easy to fall foul of them accidentally. You have to go on the sex offenders register as a trans person and as a sex worker, and what happens then? So this is something I really worry about. That's what the trans community's been talking about here. So whilst I think I understand why someone would look at, you can't change gender if you've had a conviction for sexual assault because it looks bad for the trans community, there are insidious ways that this will affect people who don't deserve it, and could be expanded in ways that would hurt the community even more. Like once you cross that Rubicon, how far will they let it go? That's my worry.
Thoughtful words there, very nuanced, and I really appreciate that. I suppose coming from the Tory party, they've never cared. So I guess if this was organisations coming together and advising on something, that would be different. But because it's the Tories, you know it's going to be insidious. But I appreciate your nuance there, and I appreciate that. That is it for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. Obviously, our normal island shows are pretty rare, but you can help Turn Left grow, which would mean a more variety of content. If you can, then you can support the channel on Patreon by going to patreon.com/turnleftmedia, and please consider becoming a patron for just £3 per month. You can also follow Helena on all socials, including YouTube. Just go to @NoJusticeMTG, and please subscribe to her channel. She does excellent content. Please help her grow too. Of course, she's been gaining some traction. She appeared on Novara Media for the second time tonight. But it's so important that we grow a left media community to take on the likes of the mainstream media and the right wing, such as GB News. Thank you so much, Helena, and thanks everyone for watching.